Dear friends, welcome to our channel. We are very excited to share with you different stories about love and betrayal from around the world. So let's begin our story journey today. George stood on the edge of the farm field, gazing at the gradually yellowing wheat fields in the distance, his brows involuntarily furrowed. For 18 years, this land had nourished his family and carried his dreams, but in recent months, the land seemed to be quietly sending him some kind of warning. When he bent down to scoop up a handful of soil, that unnatural scent made his heart tighten. "Checking your precious soil again?" Martha's voice came from behind, her tone carrying undisguised mockery. "We need to talk about the community gathering at the end of the month. Can you spare your valuable time?" George straightened up, brushing the soil from his hands, looking at his wife's carefully applied makeup and high heels obviously unsuitable for the farm. Martha had gone to town again today. The fourth time in 3 months she had returned empty-handed after shopping. "Of course, we can talk, but I'd like to discuss this first." George pointed to the stream in the distance showing abnormal colors. "I took water samples yesterday, and the concentration is higher than last month." Martha's eyes flickered for a moment, and she quickly turned away. "I don't want to hear your environmental lecture again. It's been 20 years, George, and we're still living in this isolated place. I'm 48. And I don't want to continue like this. The farm income is stable. We don't lack money," George said calmly. "Stable?" Martha laughed, a laugh that hurt George's ears. "Stable poverty, that's all. Look at Laura. Why didn't she come back after college graduation? Because there's nothing here except dirt and sweat. Laura is doing the environmental work she loves. That was her choice," George said. "Just like you chose to marry a farmer." Martha suddenly fell silent, a flash of complexity in her eyes. "People change, George. Some people are content with the status quo, others yearn for change." She paused for a moment, then said, "By the way, Rick will come tomorrow to discuss that agricultural product purchase contract. He says he has a new cooperation proposal." At the mention of Rick, Martha's eyes lit up, a subtle change that didn't escape George's observation. Rick was an agricultural product buyer who had appeared in their lives 6 months ago, representing a large company called Green Agriculture. The purchase prices he offered were always higher than the market, which attracted many farmers. But George remained vigilant. He didn't believe money would fall from the sky. "I'll listen to his proposal," George answered briefly, but his gaze fell on the new dress carefully chosen by Martha. The atmosphere at the dinner table was, as always, gloomy. Martha pushed the food around on her plate, her mind obviously elsewhere. George tried to talk about Laura's recent work. Supposedly, the environmental organization where she worked was investigating several cases of water pollution. "Could you talk about something else?" Martha suddenly looked up. "Laura only cares about her trees and water, just like you." "There's nothing wrong with that." George put down his fork. "People need something to hold on to." "Hold on to?" Martha laughed coldly. "Hold on to a mediocre life for 20 years, day in and day out." George didn't reply, and silence spread between them. The cracks in a marriage don't form in a day, but accumulate from countless moments like this. He recalled when they met. Martha was the town librarian. She enjoyed reading books about big cities and dreamed of someday leaving this small town. When George proposed to her, she had hesitated several times, finally moved by George's sincerity and promises of a better life. However, farm life wasn't as romantic as Martha had imagined. Hard work, changing seasons, monotony year after year, gradually eroded her enthusiasm. George wasn't unaware of Martha's dissatisfaction, but he deeply loved this land and couldn't imagine leaving it. Their differences were briefly reconciled after Laura's birth, but as Laura grew up and chose to leave home, the sense of loss in Martha's heart resurfaced. The next day, the sun was bright but not glaring, a typical beautiful spring day. Rick's car punctually appeared on the farm's path, and a brand new black SUV stopped in the yard amid swirling dust. George noticed that Martha had already changed into her new dress and was waiting on the porch. "Good morning, beautiful Mrs. Martha." Rick smiled as he approached, with a slender build and elegant manners that contrasted sharply with the surrounding farmland. "Today's sunshine seems to be attracted by your beauty as well." Martha blushed slightly, laughing like a young girl. "Don't say that, Rick. George is right there." George walked up and shook hands with Rick, noticing that the other man's hands had few calluses, which was not characteristic of someone who regularly dealt with agricultural products. "Mr. George, this time I bring a new proposal from the company." Rick went straight to the point. "In addition to continuing to purchase your agricultural products at a high price, we also hope to rent that unused piece of land at the edge of your farm to store some agricultural production materials." "What kind of production materials?" George asked cautiously. "Mainly fertilizers, pesticides, some chemical agents to increase yield," Rick quickly answered. "Completely in line with environmental standards, won't cause any damage to the land. The rent will be very considerable, $5,000 per month." George saw Martha's eyes light up when he heard this figure. This was almost a full quarter of their farm's net income. "Why choose our land to store these things?" George continued to ask. Rick explained with a smile. "Your farm has an excellent geographical location, close to several of our major clients, which can save transportation costs. Also, your farm is well managed. We believe this is the safest choice." George thought for a moment, his instinct telling him things weren't that simple. "I need time to consider," he finally said. "I'd like to know more details about these production materials." "Of course, completely understand." Rick nodded elegantly, taking out a document from his briefcase. "Here's a detailed explanation. You can read it carefully." Martha invited Rick to stay for lunch, something unprecedented. Normally, business visitors would leave immediately after the conversation. George noticed that Martha had prepared especially carefully for this lunch, even buying wine from town. During the meal, Rick talked about life in the big city, all those bright lights, cultural and artistic activities, and unlimited opportunities. Martha listened with full attention, with a gleam of longing in her eyes. George rarely saw her with such an animated expression, at least not in recent years. "Martha, you know what? A smart, elegant lady like you would have many more opportunities to show your talent in the city," Rick said, looking directly at Martha. "Frankly, I've never understood why you chose to stay here." "Choices made in youth are often not based on rationality," Martha replied softly, her gaze toward the window, avoiding looking in George's direction. George put down his cutlery, feeling a stab of pain. 20 years of marriage, at this moment, reduced simply to an irrational youth decision. "Life is long. There's always opportunity to make new choices," Rick said casually, as if talking about changing clothes. After lunch, George excused himself to check the fields. He needed to be alone, needed air. When he returned, he found Rick's car still parked in the yard, and from the house came Martha's laughter, a sound he hadn't heard in a long time. In the following weeks, Rick's visits became increasingly frequent, always bringing new gifts or stories from the city. Martha's attitude also changed noticeably. She began to take more care with her appearance, frequently went out shopping, and sometimes didn't come home all day. George tried to talk to her, but each attempt ended in argument. On an ordinary afternoon, George received a phone call from Laura. She said she would come to visit them on the weekend and also collect some local water samples for environmental research. George didn't tell her that the water quality near the farm was already showing abnormalities. He wanted Laura to see for herself. Laura's arrival brought a brief period of vitality to the quiet farm. She warmly embraced her parents, then immediately went to the stream to collect water samples. That evening, George found an opportunity to speak with Laura alone. "The water's not right, is it?" George asked. Laura nodded, her expression grave. "Not just here, Dad. Our organization has recently discovered abnormalities in the water sources of several nearby farms and is investigating possible sources of pollution. I've noticed some abnormalities lately, too." George hesitated for a moment, then said, "There's a company called Green Agriculture that wants to rent a piece of our farmland to store chemical agents." "Green Agriculture?" Laura's frown deepened. "Dad, this company is on our watch list. There are rumors that they don't comply with regulations in handling chemical waste. You haven't agreed to rent land to them, have you?" "Not yet." George shook his head. "But your mother seems very supportive of this proposal." Laura seemed about to say something, but finally just patted her father's shoulder. "Trust your instincts, Dad. I'll speed up the investigation process." One evening after Laura's return to the city, George accidentally discovered several unfamiliar large plastic barrels in the barn. They were carefully covered, but George still noticed the blurred chemical warning signs on the barrels. He was about to approach to inspect when Martha's voice suddenly came from behind. "What are you doing here?" Martha asked, with an unnatural tension in her voice. "What are these?" George pointed to the barrels. "Fertilizer samples that Rick sent," Martha quickly explained. "He wants us to try them out, see how they work." "Why didn't you tell me?" George asked. "I wanted to surprise you." Martha's smile seemed forced. "If they work well, it could increase our production." George didn't ask further, but that night he returned to the barn and carefully examined the barrels. Parts of the labels had been torn off, but he could still make out the words hazardous waste. He took photos and sent them to Laura. In the following days, George began to observe Martha's actions more closely. She frequently made and received phone calls, always going outside the house or locking herself in the bathroom. One evening, while Martha was in the shower, her phone received a message and the screen lit up. George hesitated for a moment, but finally decided to take a look. The message was from Rick. "Meet tomorrow night at the usual place. All arranged with the barrels. Payment has been transferred to your account. Remember to delete this message." George's heart felt as if it had been stabbed, but he decided to continue observing and gathering more evidence. He installed several small cameras at key locations on the farm, originally intended to monitor wildlife activity, now tools for collecting evidence of his wife's betrayal. The next day, Martha told George she was going to town to attend a book club and might return late. George pretended indifference, but after she left, he drove to town. At the library door, he didn't see Martha's car. After driving by several possible locations, he found Martha's car in the parking lot of an upscale restaurant, next to Rick's unmistakable black SUV. George didn't disturb them immediately, but chose to wait. 2 hours later, Martha and Rick walked out of the restaurant together, smiling. To George's shock, they embraced in front of the car, then shared an unmistakable kiss. 20 years of marriage crumbled in that moment. Upon returning to the farm, George continued gathering evidence. His cameras recorded Martha and Rick moving those suspicious barrels to the edge of the farm in the middle of the night. He even followed them once and discovered they were pouring the contents of the barrels into a hidden pit, then burying it. George collected soil samples from that location and nearby water samples, then sent them to Laura for testing. A few days later, Laura called back to confirm his worst fear. These samples contained high concentrations of toxic substances, including heavy metals and industrial solvents. "Dad, this isn't just a violation of environmental regulations." Laura's voice revealed serious concern. "These substances can cause severe health problems, especially in cases of long-term exposure. Our organization has already gathered several similar cases, and all evidence points to green agriculture." George felt dizzy. "Are you sure? Is this evidence reliable?" "Labs don't lie, Dad." Laura's tone was firm. "We're already prepared to submit all materials to the Environmental Protection Agency and the FBI." But she hesitated for a moment. If Mom is really involved, she could face charges too. George took a deep breath. "Do what you must do, Laura. The truth can't be hidden, regardless of the cost." After hanging up the phone, George sat at a high point on the farm for a long time, watching the sunset, his heart incredibly heavy. Not only did he have to face his wife's infidelity, but also accept the fact that she had participated in poisoning the land he deeply loved. During the following week, George acted normally, but each of his movements was carefully calculated. He continued gathering evidence, including communication records between Martha and Rick. He installed a data recovery software on Martha's phone, bank transfer records, and detailed photos of those barrels and the coordinates of the pollution sites. Meanwhile, Laura and her organization accelerated the pace of their investigation. They visited multiple affected farms and collected numerous samples and witness testimonies. All evidence pointed to a systematic environmental crime. Rick's company, Green Agriculture, was actually an industrial waste processing enterprise. They received waste at a price far below the legal processing cost, and then, by bribing farm owners, buried these toxic substances around farmland. Martha seemed completely immersed in her relationship with Rick, not noticing George's unusual behavior. She became increasingly brazen, sometimes even answering Rick's calls in front of George, just making a weak excuse to brush it off. A month later, Laura notified George that they had enough evidence to report to the authorities. Action would take place in 2 days, with the EPA and FBI simultaneously searching multiple locations, including Green Agriculture, offices and the involved farms. Dad, you need to prepare yourself psychologically, Laura said gently. This will be a media storm, and Mom is likely to be implicated. George nodded. I understand. I've contacted a lawyer and prepared my own evidence. Laura looked at her father with surprise. You've collected evidence? What kind of evidence? About your mother and Rick, and about those barrels. George's tone was calm but determined. I won't protect a traitor at the expense of more people's health and the land I love. Laura hugged her father, feeling his physical tension and emotional pain. Dad, you're the bravest person. On the day before the planned action, Martha suddenly proposed to talk with George. Her attitude was unusually serious, even somewhat nervous. George, I think we need to talk seriously about our marriage. Martha sat at the dining table, her fingers nervously fidgeting with her cup. George remained silent, waiting for her to continue. We both know that our feelings haven't been the same in recent years. Martha avoided George's gaze. I think perhaps we should consider separating for a while. Why bring this up now? George asked, his voice surprisingly calm. Martha took a deep breath. I'm not happy, George. I've never really adapted to life here. I want more opportunities, more experiences. Is Rick the one who gave you these opportunities and experiences? George looked directly into Martha's eyes and asked. Martha's face changed, but she quickly regained her composure. This isn't just about Rick. It's about the life I want, a life that can't be found on this farm. So what do you plan to do? George asked. I want a divorce, Martha said directly. Rick knows a good lawyer. He's already helped me prepare the documents. Considering that the farm is your family property, I won't ask for its division, but I demand appropriate economic compensation. George looked at this woman with whom he had shared 20 years of his life and felt a strange calmness. He once loved her deeply, built this home for her, but now, the person before him had become a stranger. All right, George simply replied. I'll consider your demands and contact my own lawyer. Martha seemed somewhat surprised, apparently not expecting George to accept so easily. That's it? You don't want to save our marriage. Some things, once broken, can't be repaired, Martha. George stood up. I think we both need to be honest about that. Martha nodded, a flash of complex emotions in her eyes, but quickly returned to determination. Tomorrow Rick will come with the lawyer. I hope we can settle this quickly. George didn't answer, simply turned and walked out of the kitchen. He knew tomorrow wouldn't be what Martha expected. The next morning dawned sunny, but with a biting chill in the air. George rose early, confirming that all the materials he had prepared were ready. He received a text message from Laura, informing him that the operation had begun and law enforcement officers were on their way to various target locations. Around 9 o'clock, Martha carefully dressed herself, putting on a brand new suit, obviously preparing for the important meeting that was coming. She paced nervously around the living room, occasionally looking out the window. They should be here soon, Martha told George, with a touch of nervousness in her voice. I hope everything resolves smoothly. I believe it will, George replied calmly. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doorbell rang. Martha quickly straightened her clothes, took a deep breath, and headed for the door. When she opened the door, she saw Rick, but beside him stood a small boy about 5 years old, tightly gripping Rick's hand. Rick? What's going on? Martha looked at the child with surprise. Where's the lawyer? There's been a change of plans. Rick forced a smile, but his eyes showed evident tension. My sister had an unexpected matter and asked me to watch her son for a few hours. Don't worry, the lawyer is on his way. Let's go in and wait first. Martha guided them inside, where George stood in the center of the living room, calmly observing all of this. Rick awkwardly nodded to George in greeting, then turned to Martha. Are the documents ready? Rick asked. Martha quickly took out a folder from a drawer. Everything's here. It just needs to be signed. At that moment, the doorbell rang again. Martha quickly walked to the door, expecting the lawyer's arrival, but when she opened it, she saw Laura, holding a newspaper of the day. Laura, Martha seemed confused. What are you doing here? There's something you should know, Mom. Laura's tone was serious. She walked into the house and noticed Rick and the small boy. It seems I've arrived just in time, Laura said, her gaze lingering on Rick for a moment. Laura, whatever you want to say, can it wait? Martha said impatiently. We're dealing with important business. Yes, it certainly is important, Laura said calmly. So important that it's on the front page of every newspaper and news broadcast today. Laura handed Martha the newspaper she was carrying. The front page bore a huge headline. Environmental Organization reveals Green Agriculture illegally dumps industrial waste. Multiple people suspected of knowing assistance. The article detailed a large-scale environmental crime investigation where Green Agriculture was accused of illegally dumping toxic industrial waste on multiple farms, severely contaminating groundwater and soil. Even more shocking, several farm owners were accused of knowingly aiding this activity, including Martha's name. Martha's face instantly turned pale. Her hands began to tremble. What does this mean? Rick? She turned to Rick, her voice trembling. Rick's expression darkened. He quickly rose from the sofa and pulled the small boy toward the door. I think we should leave first. It seems today is not a good time to discuss divorce. Wait. Martha stopped him. You can't just leave like this. Tell me this isn't true. Were those barrels really industrial waste? Rick laughed coldly. Don't play innocent, Martha. You knew what was in them. You accepted the money and even helped arrange the storage locations. But you said they were just special fertilizers. Martha was almost screaming. You said they were completely harmless, just needed special storage. And you chose to believe me, Rick said sarcastically. Because you wanted that money, wanted to escape what you called your prison, this farm. Don't push the responsibility on me. We're all adults. We all knew what we were doing. Martha stood shocked in place, as if struck by lightning. She had always thought she was just helping Rick store some special agricultural products, and although perhaps she had doubts inside, she chose to ignore these concerns because the future Rick promised was too tempting. You used me. Martha's voice was low and angry. You knew I wanted to leave here, so you used that. You used me. I gave you what you wanted, Rick said without disguise. Money, passion, the promise of escaping this rural place. As for those barrels, that was just part of the deal. Don't pretend you never suspected their true contents. Martha turned to George, with a mixture of shame and anger in her eyes. You knew? You knew all along. George calmly walked to the window and opened the curtains. Martha and Rick were surprised to see several police cars and vehicles bearing the Environmental Protection Agency logo parked at the entrance to the farm. You reported to the authorities? Martha looked at George in disbelief. Not just me, George said. Laura's environmental organization has been investigating these pollution incidents for a while. And I just provided some key evidence. You betrayed me. Martha's voice was full of accusation. No, Martha, it was you who betrayed me. Betrayed our marriage. Betrayed this land we call home. George's tone showed no anger, only a deep fatigue and disappointment. At that moment, the doorbell rang once more. George went to open the door, greeting several police officers and EPA officials. Mr. George, the lead officer asked, we have a search warrant to examine locations on your farm where hazardous waste may have been stored. At the same time, we need to speak with Mrs. Martha and Mr. Rick. Rick tried to explain, but the officer had already shown an arrest warrant. As he was being led out the door, the small boy began to cry, clutching Rick's hand and not letting go. A female officer crouched down to comfort the child, explaining that they would contact his relatives to come get him. Martha stood in the center of the living room, like a shattered statue. Her dreams, her escape plan, the new life she thought she had found, all vanished in that moment. And worse, she might face serious legal consequences. I didn't know they were toxic waste. Martha turned to George and Laura, her voice almost pleading. Rick told me they were just special fertilizers that needed special storage. I just wanted some extra income, wanted a way out. Mom, Laura interrupted her, disappointment in her voice. You received at least $50,000 in your account, and there are multiple messages of you with Rick discussing disposal and cover-up. You knew they weren't just ordinary fertilizers. Martha collapsed onto the sofa, unable to deny this. Yes, she had had suspicions, but chose to ignore them because the money and future Rick promised were too tempting. I need to speak with my lawyer, Martha finally said, her voice low and exhausted. Two officers approached and showed Martha an arrest warrant. As she was being led out of the house, she looked back at George one last time, with a complex mixture of emotions in her eyes. Anger, shame, betrayal, and a touch of too late regret. But George didn't respond to that look. He simply turned around, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a cup of coffee. The following weeks were filled with legal procedures and media coverage. The green agriculture case became national news, and Rick, as one of the main responsible parties, faced multiple criminal charges, including environmental pollution, fraud, and bribery. The company's assets were frozen, offices sealed, and numerous documents seized as evidence. Following her lawyer's advice, Martha agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a lighter sentence. She provided detailed information about Rick and the company's operations, while admitting that she knew the true contents of the barrels and received payment to assist in their storage. Considering her cooperative attitude and lack of criminal record, she was ultimately sentenced to 3 years probation, plus community service and a fine. The divorce proceedings were advancing simultaneously. Due to Martha's criminal involvement and the environmental damage caused to the farm, the court ruled that she had no right to claim the farm property, receiving only minimal economic compensation. During her bail period, Martha tried to contact George multiple times, not to apologize, but to try to explain her actions and seek more economic support. Each time, George responded through his lawyer, clearly stating that except for the necessary legal procedures, he did not wish to have any further communication with Martha. The divorce was finally finalized 3 months later, ending their 20 years of marriage. Martha moved away from the farm, temporarily living in a cheap apartment in town. She lost her job at the library because no one wanted to hire a person involved in an environmental pollution case, even on probation. Her friends distanced themselves one by one, and the community's attitude toward her changed from friendly to indifferent or even hostile. While awaiting trial, Rick tried to shift much of the responsibility to other company executives and the involved farm owners. He claimed he was only following orders from superiors, and that people like Martha were voluntarily participating. But the evidence held by the prosecution showed that Rick was one of the key organizers of the entire plan, using his charm and persuasive power to specifically approach farmers with economic difficulties or eager for change, especially people like Martha, dissatisfied with their current situation. Meanwhile, the farm's restoration work was difficult and prolonged. After evaluation by EPA experts, it was confirmed that parts of the land and water sources had been severely contaminated, requiring a professional team for decontamination. This meant that George would face huge economic pressure and years of recovery period. Laura and her environmental organization provided a lot of help. She frequently returned to the farm to assist her father with environmental restoration work. During this process, the relationship between father and daughter grew even closer. "Do you still hate Mom?" One day, while helping George test water quality, Laura suddenly asked. George raised his head, thought for a moment. "I don't hate her, Laura. Hate requires energy and emotional investment, and I don't want to waste any of that. I've moved past it. But you won't forgive her, will you?" "Some actions are beyond forgiveness," George said calmly. "She not only betrayed me, but participated in poisoning this land, endangering our community's health. This wasn't a momentary impulse or emotional weakness. It was a series of conscious decisions. I can accept that it has happened, but I won't forgive or pretend it never occurred." Laura nodded, understanding her father's position. A year later, Rick's trial concluded, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, plus facing huge fines. Green agriculture was permanently shut down, and the company executives all received varying degrees of legal punishment. Most of the company's assets were used for environmental restoration and victim compensation, but this was far from enough to repair the damage caused. During her probation period, Martha barely found a job as a cashier at a small supermarket. She lived in a small rented apartment with a tight and lonely life. She often sat by the window, looking at the distant scenery, reflecting on her choices and their consequences. She had wanted to escape what she considered a mediocre life through Rick, but fell into an even narrower cage. Sometimes, Martha would write letters or send messages to Laura, asking about George's situation and the farm's recovery. Laura would typically reply briefly about her father's situation, but never conveyed any of Martha's messages to George, respecting her father's decision. Martha never truly believed she had done anything wrong. In her view, she had simply seized an opportunity, trying to change her life. She certainly paid a price for her actions, but she still believed that, had they not been discovered, her plan with Rick could have succeeded. This mindset prevented her from truly facing her responsibility and rebuilding her life. Meanwhile, Rick was living a completely different life in prison. His former charm and confidence were shattered by the reality of jail. He tried to reduce his sentence by accusing others, but this only made him more unpopular among his fellow inmates. His company had gone bankrupt, with few personal assets remaining after compensations, and his future was bleak. One day, Martha accidentally encountered Laura at the supermarket. She tried to approach and talk, hoping to re-establish the connection with George through their daughter. "Is he doing well?" Martha asked, with a flash of hope in her eyes. "He's rebuilding his life, Mom," Laura replied calmly. "Most of the farm has recovered. He started an organic farming project." "Has he mentioned me at all?" Laura shook her head. "No, Mom. Since the divorce, he hasn't mentioned you." A flash of loss crossed Martha's eyes, but she quickly composed herself. "Tell him that if he needs any help or just wants to talk." "Stop, Mom," Laura interrupted her. "Dad has clearly expressed that he doesn't want any contact with you. Respecting his choice is the best thing you can do now." Martha fell silent, finally nodding, accepting this reality. 5 years later, most of the farm's land had regained its health. George continued his life as a farmer, but had added organic cultivation and environmental education. His farm became an environmental education base for local schools, receiving hundreds of students each year for visits and learning. Beatrice founded her own environmental consulting company, specializing in providing ecological cultivation advice and soil health assessments to farmers. She often brought her team to her father's farm for field training and research. One weekend, George and Laura were having tea on the farm's front porch, enjoying the quiet sunset. Laura mentioned that she had recently encountered Rick by chance in the city. "How did he look?" George asked, with no anger in his voice, just a touch of curiosity. "Pretty bad," Laura said. "After getting out of prison, he can't find formal work, only does odd jobs to make a living. He tried to contact some of his former business partners, but no one wants anything to do with him." George nodded, showing no sympathy. For him, Rick had received the punishment he deserved. "Mom isn't doing well either." Laura hesitated for a moment, then said, "She moved to that small apartment on Elm Street, still works at the supermarket. She often asks about you." "She made her choice," George simply replied. "We're all living with the consequences of our choices." Laura nodded understandingly, not bringing up the topic again. Several more years passed, and a rumor began circulating around town. Rick had died in an accident. Reportedly, he was driving under the influence of alcohol and drove off the road guardrail. Ironically, the accident site was near an area where he had once arranged waste dumping. Martha attended the funeral alone, a simple and sparse ceremony with only a few people present. As she stood at Rick's grave, her heart was filled with complex emotions. This man had brought her passion and hope, but ultimately led to the collapse of her life. However, she couldn't blame him entirely, because every step included her own decisions. That same winter, George received a letter from Martha. It was the first time she had contacted him directly since the divorce. In the letter, Martha didn't ask for forgiveness, but simply expressed her understanding of her actions. "I don't expect your forgiveness, nor any form of reconciliation," she wrote. "I just want you to know that I have paid for my choices and continue to pay every day. I once thought our life was a form of imprisonment, but now I understand that the real imprisonment was my own desires and dissatisfactions. I hope you and Laura are well." After reading the letter, George didn't respond. For him, that chapter was completely closed. He chose to focus his energy on the path ahead, not on looking back at a past that couldn't be changed. On a warm spring morning, George stood at the edge of a newly planted organic wheat field, feeling the gentle spring breeze caress his face. Not far away, Laura and her team were analyzing the water quality of the stream, the data showing that contaminants had fallen below safe levels. This land, like George himself, had experienced harm and betrayal, but ultimately showed an incredible resilience. Areas that were once contaminated were now full of new plants. The stream was clear again, and birds flew freely in the sky. George took a deep breath, feeling the fragrance of the earth. He had left behind the pain of the past, but would never forget that lesson. People's choices define their lives, and betrayal, whether to people or to the land, always has its price. He turned toward Laura with a peaceful smile on his face. Ahead was a new day, a new growing season, a new life. That past covered with betrayal and lies he had left forever behind. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. We look forward to seeing you in our next story.